In the shattered final weeks of World War II, Germany was no longer defended by seasoned veterans. It was defended by children. Boys with smooth faces, oversized uniforms, and rifles that felt heavier than their arms. They stood in burning cities and frozen forests, believing one terrifying promise. If the Americans captured them, they would not live to see another sunrise. On one cold morning in April 1945, a group of these boys stood trembling beside a muddy road in southern Germany. Their weapons were gone. Their hands were raised. Some were only 13 years old. They were hungry, exhausted, and certain they were about to die. They had been told for years that American soldiers were brutal killers who shot prisoners, especially members of the Hitler Youth. The boys waited for the command. They expected rifle fire. They expected to collapse into the dirt. Instead, they saw something they could not understand. An American soldier approached carrying a tray of steaming hot dogs. For a few seconds, none of the boys moved. They thought it was some kind of trick. But the smell was real. Warm bread, cooked meat, mustard, the first real meal many of them had seen in days. Their knees were shaking, not from gunfire, but from confusion. Everything they had believed was beginning to collapse. That moment stayed with them for the rest of their lives. To understand why a simple hot dog became one of the most unforgettable memories of the war, you have to go back to the beginning, when these boys were taught to fear the world and worship a dying regime. In 1926, the Nazi Party created the Hitler Youth, known in German as the Hitler Jugend. At first it was a political youth group. By the 1930s it became a massive organization designed to shape the minds of German children. Boys marched, camped, sang, and trained. They learned obedience, physical fitness, and absolute loyalty to Adolf Hitler. They were told they were the future of Germany. By 1939, membership had become effectively mandatory. Millions of boys wore brown uniforms and practiced military skills long before they were old enough to join the army. They learned map reading, rifle drill, grenade throwing, and anti-tank tactics. But the most powerful lessons were not physical. They were psychological. These children were told that Germany was surrounded by enemies. They were taught that surrender was dishonor. They were warned that Allied soldiers would torture them if captured. American troops were often portrayed as gangsters and mercenaries. Soviet troops were depicted as monsters. The message was simple and relentless. Fight to the end, or suffer a fate worse than death. For years, many boys believed every word. At first, the war seemed distant. Germany conquered Poland, France, and much of Europe with astonishing speed. Young boys cheered as victories piled up. They collected aircraft silhouettes and followed battlefield maps. It felt as though Germany could not lose. Then the tide turned. The defeat at Battle of Stalingrad in early 1943 shattered the illusion of invincibility. Allied bombers began devastating German cities. Food became scarce. Fathers and older brothers stopped coming home. By 1944, enemy armies were closing in from east and west. That same year, Nazi leaders began using younger and younger boys in combat support roles. 16-year-olds manned anti-aircraft guns in cities like Berlin and Hamburg. Some were decorated for bravery. Their stories were used in propaganda to inspire others. One of the most famous examples was Alfred Zeck, who was celebrated in 1945 after reportedly leading wounded soldiers to safety. Such stories reinforced the idea that youth could save the nation. But no amount of propaganda could replace trained soldiers. On October 18, 1944, Germany formed the Volkssturm, a national militia that mobilized old men and boys to defend the homeland. The name meant people's storm. In practice, it was a desperate measure. Units were often poorly equipped. Some had only a handful of rifles, a few anti-tank weapons, and little ammunition. Among them were countless Hitler Youth boys. By early 1945, the Western Allies had crossed into Germany. The Battle of the Bulge had failed. American divisions pushed through the Rhineland and into Bavaria. Town after town fell. Bridges were seized, roads filled with refugees, retreating troops, and children carrying weapons. In many villages, local Nazi officials ordered teenage boys to resist. Posters warned that cowards would be hanged. Some boys believed they were defending their families. Others were terrified but saw no alternative. One 15-year-old later recalled that his unit consisted of schoolboys led by a wounded veteran who barely knew their names. They had Panzerfaust anti-tank launchers, bolt-action rifles, and almost no food. Their uniforms were mismatched. Their boots did not fit. Yet they were told they could stop American tanks. The Panzerfaust was simple and deadly. Even a teenager could destroy an armored vehicle at close range. This gave commanders a dangerous confidence. Hidden in rubble or forests, young boys were sent to ambush advancing tanks, often with suicidal odds. In places such as Nuremberg, Würzburg, and Munich, American soldiers repeatedly encountered defenders who looked shockingly young. Hardened infantrymen from divisions like the 45th Infantry Division and the 3rd Infantry Division saw boys peering from foxholes and cellar windows. Some fought fiercely. Some ran at the first artillery barrage. Some stood frozen, unable to fire. American reactions varied. Combat was brutal, and boys carrying anti-tank weapons were genuine threats. U.S. troops returned fire without hesitation when attacked. But when these defenders surrendered, many American soldiers were stunned by their age. They saw frightened children in uniforms. In April 1945, the collapse accelerated. Franklin D. Roosevelt died on April 12, but the Allied advance did not slow. American armored columns swept through southern Germany toward the Alps. Rumors spread that Nazi leaders planned a final stand in the mountains. Units pushed hard to prevent it. Along roads lined with blossoming trees and bomb craters, small groups of German teenagers continued to appear. One such group had spent several nights without proper sleep. Their unit had been ordered to delay the Americans near a village outside Munich. Their leader, likely a non-commissioned officer in his 30s, disappeared during the night. By dawn, the boys were alone. The youngest was 13. The oldest was 17. They were cold and starving. Their ammunition was nearly gone. In the distance, they heard engines, then the metallic clatter of tracks. American vehicles were approaching. For these boys, the fear of capture was almost as strong as the fear of battle. They had absorbed years of warnings. They imagined beatings, torture, and execution. Some considered using their last bullets on themselves rather than surrendering. But when the first American tanks and half-tracks appeared, resistance collapsed. The boys emerged slowly with their hands up. Some were crying. One had thrown away his boots because his feet were bleeding. Another still wore his Hitler Youth armband. The Americans searched them quickly and took their weapons. The boys waited beside the road. Minutes felt like hours. Nearby, U.S. soldiers from a field kitchen unit were preparing breakfast. Army cooks operated mobile kitchens mounted on trailers. These could provide thousands of hot meals to frontline troops. Men who had marched and fought for days depended on these kitchens for coffee, meat, bread, and morale. One American looked at the prisoners and recognized what they were. Kids the soldiers had every reason to be angry. Some had lost friends to sniper fire and Panzerfaust attacks launched by boys not much older than middle school students. Yet many also had younger brothers back home. Some were fathers. Looking at these thin, exhausted prisoners, they saw children trapped inside a collapsing dictatorship. An American sergeant reportedly told the cooks to feed them. Soon, hot dogs were placed into the boys' hands. To Americans, it was ordinary food. To the prisoners, it was something almost unbelievable. Many had never eaten a hot dog in a bun. Wartime shortages had reduced German diets to potatoes, turnips, black bread, and thin soup. Meat was scarce. Fresh white bread was a luxury. The smell alone was overwhelming. At first, some boys hesitated. They suspected poison. Others were too hungry to care. One bit into the soft bread and hot sausage and began to cry. It was not just the taste, it was the realization that they were going to live. No one was shouting. No one was beating them. American soldiers laughed, smoked cigarettes, and offered coffee. The scene felt so normal that it became surreal. Years of propaganda dissolved in a single meal. The boys looked at one another in disbelief. These were the monsters they had been taught to fear. As more prisoners were collected, the teenagers were moved to temporary holding areas. There they received additional food, medical attention, and basic processing. Their names, ages, and units were recorded. Some were so young that American guards shook their heads while writing down birth dates. The war around them was still violent. Gunfire echoed from nearby towns. Columns of vehicles rolled west to east. Aircraft passed overhead. Yet for these boys, the psychological war had already ended. Many later said surrender brought overwhelming relief. This reaction was common across Germany in the final weeks. Thousands of Hitler Youth and Volkssturm members discovered that the world outside Nazi propaganda was very different from what they had been told. While treatment varied depending on circumstances and battlefield tensions, U.S. policy generally required humane handling of prisoners under the Geneva Conventions. Food was often the first sign. American logistics were immense. Even frontline troops usually had access to rations such as K rations, C rations, and hot meals when field kitchens could reach them. To starving German civilians and prisoners, this abundance was astonishing. Chocolate, chewing gum, canned meat, and white bread became symbols of another world. For the captured boys, the hot dog represented more than kindness. It represented the collapse of certainty. Everything they had trusted was suddenly in question. If the Americans were not executioners, what else had been false? Was the war truly lost? Had their sacrifices meant anything? Why had adults sent children to fight battles that could not be won? These questions stayed with them long after the guns fell silent. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler died in his bunker in Berlin. German instrument of surrender was signed on May 7, taking effect on May 8. The Third Reich, which had promised 1,000 years, had lasted just 12. For former child soldiers, the aftermath was deeply complicated. Some returned to devastated hometowns. Some remained in prisoner camps for months. Many struggled with shame, grief, and confusion. They had been both participants and victims. Decades later, historians and memoirs helped reveal their experiences. Former Hitler Youth members often described the final days of the war not as glorious resistance, but as chaos. They remembered absent leaders, impossible orders, and overwhelming fear. And sometimes they remembered unexpected humanity. One veteran recalled that the first American who searched him took his knife, then handed him a cigarette even though he was too young to smoke. Another remembered tasting chocolate for the first time. Several described receiving hot food immediately after surrender. These details appeared again and again because they were so profoundly at odds with what they had been taught. Food became a language stronger than propaganda. For American soldiers, such gestures were rarely seen as extraordinary. Sharing rations with prisoners was practical and often instinctive. But to the boys on the receiving end, it was unforgettable. Imagine being 14 years old. For years, authority figures tell you that capture means torture and death. Your city is in ruins. Your friends are dead or missing. You surrender with your heart pounding, certain this is the final moment of your life. Then an enemy soldier places warm food into your shaking hands. That contrast is almost impossible to forget. The hot dog itself was a distinctly American symbol, though its roots trace back to German sausages. In one of history's strange ironies, a food with German origins returned to German children as a gesture of mercy from the army they feared most. The symbolism is powerful. A dictatorship had fed them slogans. Their captors fed them breakfast. This does not erase the suffering caused by Nazi Germany. The Hitler Youth was an instrument of indoctrination that helped prolong a catastrophic war. Some youth units committed serious acts of violence. American soldiers were also under immense stress, and not every encounter ended with compassion. War remained brutal until the last day. But the story of those boys beside the road matters because it reveals a different truth about the end of the war. The collapse of the Third Reich was not only a military defeat. It was the breaking of a psychological prison built in the minds of children. The boys expected death because they had been taught to expect death. What they received instead was evidence that their worldview had been constructed on fear and lies. Many of those former child soldiers grew into adults who rarely spoke about their experiences. When they finally did, the details were often small and concrete. The smell of gasoline, the sound of tank tracks, mud on their boots, and the taste of a hot dog eaten with trembling hands. That first bite was more than food. It was proof that the war was over. It was proof that surrender did not mean dishonor. It was proof that enemies could choose mercy. And for some of those boys, it was the first moment they began to think for themselves. On a roadside in southern Germany, sometime in April 1945, children prepared to die. They stood in silence under gray skies, surrounded by soldiers they had been taught to fear. Then steam rose from fresh bread, and the smell of cooked sausage drifted through the cold morning air. No speech was given. No grand lesson was announced. Just a simple meal. Yet in that ordinary act was one of the most extraordinary moments of the war. Not because it changed the outcome. The war was already ending. But because it changed lives. It showed a group of frightened boys that the world was larger and more complicated than the ideology that had shaped them. Long after the ruins were cleared and the uniforms were put away, they still remembered that moment. They remembered waiting for bullets. They remembered receiving hot dogs instead. And they remembered the exact instant fear gave way to disbelief. Disbelief gave way to relief, and relief gave way to a new understanding that would stay with them forever.